experience to observe chimpanzees in nature. I remember the first time that I saw wild chimpanzees in the forest, and I was amazed by how incredibly human so many of their behaviors are. For example, a mother who doesn't want her young daughter to stray too far away might reach out to grab her and pull her in closer, which happened shortly after I took this photograph, and it's probably something that a lot of the parents in the audience can relate to. And young chimpanzees spend an enormous amount of energy playing in what may resemble games that you'd see on your typical preschool or elementary school playgrounds. One thing that continually struck me during my time with the chimpanzees was just how strong some of the social bonds are between animals. And one of my favorite examples is two young mothers named Wilma and Quinto. Wilma and Quinto were both roughly 18 years old, and they were both raising their first baby at the same time as each other. And as far as I could tell, these two chimpanzees were inseparable. If I saw Quinto alone in a fruit tree, I would stop and think to myself, okay, how long until Wilma gets here? And sure enough, literally without fail, she would show up just a few minutes later. In addition to major threats like deforestation and hunting, infectious diseases pose many important risks to endangered great apes. And what makes matters worse is that because humans and other great apes share we're so genetically similar, we can share many infectious diseases with each other. And we refer to these pathogens as being zoonotic because they can be shared between humans and other animals. It's estimated that over 60% of the infectious diseases in our medical textbooks are zoonotic, which means that animals play a hugely important role in the life cycles for most of our pathogens. In fact, the term One Health has come to encompass this idea that our health is intricately connected to the health of the environment and other animals. And under this One Health framework, physicians, veterinarians, and ecologists all work together to address health issues. Now, it's important to point out that One Health is not a new concept, but in recent years, things like deforestation and overpopulation have led to an unprecedented amount of human-wildlife interactions. And this has all made zoonotic diseases a growing concern. For years, researchers and veterinarians have discussed the idea of vaccinating great apes for some of the more worrisome diseases. And vaccines exist for many pathogens that affect great apes, for things like Ebola, measles, and influenza. Now, ideally, we would want to vaccinate everyone in a population for optimum protection. But logistically, it is incredibly challenging to vaccinate wild animals. And this is primarily due to the difficulties in administering vaccines to a large enough portion of a wildlife population in order to prevent an outbreak. I mean, keep in mind that these animals live in incredibly dense forests, and at times it can be difficult just to find them. But what if we could vaccinate fewer great apes and still prevent outbreaks? Perhaps some animals have key characteristics that make them more likely to acquire a pathogen and then spread it widely to others in the community. And if we specifically targeted these super spreading animals, we might be able to prevent outbreaks using fewer vaccines. During a particularly devastating disease outbreak, a colleague of mine gained some insight into a characteristic that might be worth focusing on. In 2003, Damien Caillot was studying gorilla behavior in the Republic of Congo when Ebola nearly wiped out his entire study population with a brutal mortality rate of 95%. And in studying which gorillas became infected with Ebola, he made a really interesting discovery. Damien realized that the social gorillas were twice as likely to die of Ebola as the more solitary ones. And this finding suggests that targeting the most social animals in a population may be an effective way to help prevent outbreaks in wildlife. And as a parallel to this, some interesting work has shown that differences in sociality among humans can affect the spread of some of our infectious diseases, diseases like HIV, SARS, and influenza. And so much like we think of ourselves as being connected to a social network through Facebook, we can also visualize these social networks to explore the transmission of some of our infectious diseases. For example, here's the transmission network from the SARS 2003 outbreak in China. And lines between people here show transmission events in which one sick person infected somebody else with SARS. And you'll notice in looking at this figure that it's really just a handful of people that are responsible for a majority of these transmission events. And we refer to these people as being central to the network because they had a huge number of contacts that allowed them to spread a pathogen to so many other people in their community. And using computerized simulations, researchers have found that targeting these central people for pathogen control could prevent outbreaks using fewer vaccines. So all of this is what brought me to Uganda. For my PhD research, I was incredibly fortunate to spend a year in Kibale National Park studying how we could use what we know about social behavior to help prevent disease outbreaks in great ape populations. And protecting great apes from disease will help save this very endangered population, but it could also help prevent zoonotic pathogens like Ebola from spilling over into humans. So two of the big questions of my research are, much like has been done for humans, can we identify which chimpanzees are going to be the most social within their networks? And then once we've done that, can targeting these highly connected individuals help prevent outbreaks using fewer vaccines? To answer these questions, I spent most of my time in Kibale National Park studying one chimpanzee population. And my typical day consisted of following a group of chimpanzees around in the forest and pretty much just documenting the daily drama. So I would take notes on who contacted who and how often. And one of the really cool things about studying chimpanzees in the wild that you may not be aware of is that you don't need any special equipment. So no radio collars or special tags to tell individuals apart from each other. Because much like us, chimpanzees have very unique facial features and very individualized personalities. And this means that you can simply observe chimpanzees in their natural habitat and with some time be able to recognize each of them individually. When I came home to the US, I used the behavioral data that I collected in the field to build social networks for the chimpanzee population that I saw in the forest. And in this network that I'm showing you, each circle represents a chimpanzee from the population that I studied. And these lines between chimpanzees show how much time two individuals spent hanging out together in the forest. And it also gives us an idea of how likely they might have been to share a disease with one another. You'll notice that some of these lines vary in thickness, where a thick line might represent two chimpanzees that were really good friends with each other, like Wilma and Quinto, whereas a thin line may be more of your frenemies, or two chimpanzees that were kind of merely tolerating each other. And then just like we saw in the SARS transmission network, some of the chimpanzees were really social butterflies with a whole lot of connections, and others were more peripheral to the community. And then by comparing the same community at different times of the year, we could get an idea of when disease outbreaks might be likely to occur. For example, here I'm showing you two different networks, and we can see that in January it was pretty sparse. And during this time, there was hardly any fruit on the trees, and the chimpanzees were extremely spread out in the forest while they were foraging for food. If you contrast that to April, there was plenty of fruit in the trees, and several of the females were ready to mate. And if you're a chimpanzee, it seems like these are two key ingredients for a good party. So by comparing the networks for the same community at different times of the year, we can see that a sick chimpanzee in January might get a few others sick, but a sick chimpanzee in April could lead to a community-wide outbreak. So next we wanted to try and identify which chimpanzees would be central to these networks. And we found that this was the high-ranking moms and juveniles with large families. And we think this is a bit of a daycare effect, where a mom with a big family would hang out with another mom who had a big family. And in this way, these individuals would have contact with a large proportion of their population. And if any of you have children in daycare, I'm sure you are far too aware of how easily diseases can spread in these settings. So now that we had an idea of which chimpanzees were the most central in the communities, we wanted to see if targeting these highly connected individuals could help us prevent outbreaks using fewer vaccines. And much like a weather forecaster is able to use mathematical models to predict the weather, we could also use models to make predictions about which chimpanzees might become infected with a particular pathogen. For example, if this chimpanzee were to acquire Ebola virus from a bat or another animal in the forest, we could use what we know about the virus and how frequently different animals come into contact with each other to try and predict who will become infected and even how big the outbreak might become. And then we could go one step further and test out different vaccination strategies. So if we were to just randomly go into the forest and test out vaccinating different animals, we might get lucky and vaccinate a chimpanzee who is very social and has the potential to spread a pathogen to many others in the community. But if we're just randomly vaccinating animals, in some cases, we would also get unlucky and vaccinate some chimpanzees that were essentially dead ends and unlikely to ever acquire or spread a pathogen to anybody else. If instead, we specifically targeted the most social animals in the population, the chimpanzees that had the most capability to spread a disease to many others, then each vaccine could essentially offer a greater level of protection for the entire community. And when we tested out these different vaccination strategies using a computer, that is exactly what we found. So much like what I just showed you, we used a computer to set up scenarios in which one chimpanzee became infected with a pathogen like Ebola virus, which could then spread to other individuals in the community. And we found that by targeting the most social animals, we could vaccinate up to 35% fewer chimpanzees and still prevent outbreaks. And this huge drop in coverage requirements could make vaccinating great apes much more logistically easier to do in the forest. And this also means that we could use what we know about animal behavior to make wildlife vaccination strategies more effective and more efficient. So at this point, I want to take a step back and point out that this issue is a lot bigger than just Wilma and Quinto and the one chimpanzee population that I studied. Many other endangered species are threatened by infectious diseases, and wildlife often serve as reservoirs for pathogens that spill over into human populations. Innovative solutions are essential for preventing endangered species from acquiring pathogens that are deadly to them, and for also keeping these zoonotic pathogens out of human populations. Targeted disease prevention strategies, like the one that I shared with you today, could be applied to a broad range of social wildlife species. For example, we could help prevent endangered Ethiopian wolves from experiencing rabies outbreaks. Or we could help prevent wild African buffalo from acquiring tuberculosis, a pathogen that often spills over into domestic cattle and human populations. Our health is intricately connected to the health of other animals. So as deforestation and overpopulation continue in the coming years, developing effective disease prevention programs for wildlife is going to be a crucial step towards protecting endangered species, like the chimpanzees that I've come to love, and towards keeping our own species healthy. Thank you.